Sleep Awake is probably one of my favorite horror games this year, and I don't say that lightly. I have played a good chunk of games, and Sleep Awake does something that I haven't really seen a lot of other horror games do recently. It's got this extremely interesting story that kind of turns a couple of ideas of horror on its head. And the world is so psychedelic and crazy that there is just so much creativity and weirdness that is induced into almost every aspect of the game. Despite some weird little issues, like when dying in certain sneaking scenes, it takes about 30 seconds to actually get back into the game, it's a lot of fun, and I highly recommend checking it out if you're a fan of horror games. However, in this video, I want to focus on the Steam Deck and how it's actually performing on there. And honestly, I'm very impressed with what they were able to do and how to keep it looking as good as it does on the go. If you want to see more videos like this, hit that like and subscribe button, and hit the notification bell to be notified as soon as our next video goes live. A copy of the game was provided by Blumhouse Games for review. Thank you. So, when all is said and done, Sleep Awake is a surprisingly optimized game. Even at the lowest settings, the game looks and performs quite well on the Steam Deck, which, for games like this where they're very visually heavy, I would not have expected. As a horror game, I would consider visuals to be an essential part of the game, because horror games usually rely more on visuals than they do on more complex gameplay elements. And Sleep Awake is one of those games. The gameplay itself is pretty basic, so visuals take center stage. And luckily, they do hit the mark. At the default settings, which is on the lowest possible settings with a 50% resolution scale, the game will stick above 30 frames per second almost the entire time, and will usually hang around 40 to 50 in general gameplay. However, there are still a few hiccups. When walking around and loading into new areas, the frame rate will drop to the 20s, and there are some areas that have so much going on and will drop to the 20s or even lower than that in these more complex areas. There really aren't many places like this, but they do exist and are enough to disrupt the flow. Since this is on the lowest possible settings, there's really nothing else that we could possibly do other than lower the resolution even further and use upscaling, but that's going to make the graphics look even worse, and that's not something I wanted to do. So for my recommended settings, I actually recommend increasing the graphic quality overall. Yes, it is going to make some of the worse areas run a little bit worse, but these are very minimal. I tended to find that a lot of these areas did drop maybe 2 or 3 frames per second, but they were already that low to begin with. However, in most of the actual gameplay, it sticks above 30 frames per second the whole time, and it looks significantly better. So I recommend increasing the resolution scale to 75%, as well as bringing textures and anti-aliasing up to medium. Ultimately, the game will stick about 30 frames per second in, I would say, 85 to 90% of the game, and those draining areas are still going to go down below 30 frames per second, but again, it's only going down maybe 2 to 4 frames per second, so it's not a huge decrease in those areas. Ultimately, this is more taxing, but the difference in visual quality is quite significant, especially thanks to resolution scale, which makes the game look less pixelated and much sharper. Now, the game was rated verified before it released, and because it doesn't have a consistent frame rate at these default settings, I wouldn't say it should get the verified badge. However, the game is still very playable and enjoyable throughout, again, 85 to 90% of the game. So I still would recommend playing it on the go, since it is just a good game. The game does support 16:10 resolutions, has cloud saves, and controller support. There are also HDR settings that you can turn on, and it does recognize the Steam Deck OLED screen. Ultimately, Sleep Awake is going to be one of my favorite horror games this year. I can't see it any other way. Not only is it just a lot of fun, it feels great to play on the Steam Deck, and yes, there are some compromises that need to be made because it is going to drop a little bit in those problem areas, but it's still ultimately playable, so it's hard not to recommend it. Plus, by increasing the resolution scale and some of the other settings, the game looks even better, and I think it already looked good at the default lowest settings, so this is just an extra bonus. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like and subscribe button, and hit the notification bell to be notified as soon as our next video goes live. And a huge thank you to our patrons. You guys are awesome. See you next time.